Hello, this is Aaron. Welcome back to the show. My guest today is Christian Smith, who is a well known sociologist at the University of Notre Dame. He's also the author of the new book, Why Religion Went Obsolete, which is a very interesting, if sometimes depressing read. And he graciously agreed to join me to talk about the book. So, Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
When you say that religion went obsolete, what do you mean by obsolete?
Yeah, I mean pretty much what the word normally means, and that is most people feel something that's obsolete. They feel it's no longer needed or useful because something else has replaced it in function or efficiency or value or interest or fashion. Most scholars and most people talk about religious, if things aren't going well for religion, they talk about religious decline. And that's fine, that's good. But decline tends to focus on organizational metrics like number of members in a congregation or a denomination, or the percentage of Americans who believe in God or pray regularly. In this book, I'm trying to get more at a cultural dimension that I think those are indicators of something bigger and deeper and more profound at a cultural level. And that is, I think, religion going obsolete. So I think the language of obsolescence captures something that the language of decline doesn't. I want to be clear, however, that when I say obsolete, I don't mean extinct. I don't mean nobody's doing it. Obviously, there's a minority of Americans who are practicing religion. I don't mean by obsolete, I don't mean that religion is not useful to people or functional, or I also don't mean the thing that's replaced it is actually better than the thing that's obsolete. There are some things go obsolete that are actually better than the new thing. For example, music. Um, Streaming music isn't as good a quality as vinyl records, right? So, but vinyl records are obsolete. So I'm not making a value judgment about, oh, religion's no good or anything like that. I'm really just saying at a macro cultural level, since the 90s, especially among post boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, the culture has changed, and there's an emergence of what I call the millennial zeitgeist, that in which traditional religion just doesn't work, doesn't make sense. It's not really thought that much of. It has problems. I use the language, it's polluted. There's a cultural mismatch between the zeitgeist and traditional religion. Yeah, so that's what I mean as a general orientation.
The subtitle of your book is The Demise of Traditional Faith. And you talk a lot
Mhm.
about traditional religion. What is a
Yeah.
traditional religion?
Yeah. So what I mean by traditional is what most people call organized or institutionalized religion. It's what we mostly think of as the inherited main religions of the United States, mainstream religions. White Protestantism, evangelicalism, Black Protestantism, Catholicism. I add Mormonism to that. The bigger religions, the ones that have been around a longer period of time and that are more accepted in the mainstream. The reason I emphasize traditional religion is because there are alternative religions, what I call re-enchanted culture kind of religions, that are actually growing, that I think are helping to explain why traditional religion is in demise. So it's not all religions. Paganism is growing. New Age beliefs are growing. Spirituality is growing. Manifesting, crystals, alternative healing practices. This whole realm that I call a culture or re-enchantment has a religious character or quasi-religious, and it's not in decline. It's the more traditional inherited religions.
There's a famous, we'll come back to that point because I think that's an important point. There's a kind of a famous website out there called WTF Happened in 1971. And
Hmm.
it's just page after page of economic charts showing some terrible economic trend starting in 1971.
Hmm.
So, for your analysis, the year is 1991.
Hmm.
What happened in 1991
Yeah.
that caused this?
For my 1991, I don't say is all the causes happened. My general story is that the roots of the religion's obsolescence are long term. Most of them are indirect. There are things that have taken a long time to develop. But 1991, I argue, is a hinge. It's where the door started to swing in an opposite direction. For one thing, it's where we notice the very first beginning of the rise of non-religious Americans. So as long as we've been conducting surveys, about 6 or 7% of Americans say they're not religious. In 1991, that number started to bump up, and every year since then, it has been growing and growing until possibly recently it may be plateauing at a very high level, at 30 some percent. So um, that's an indicator of something that started to change, and it started in 1991. Other really big forces related to my argument are the end of the Cold War. A book explains this in detail, but in short, during the Cold War, for much of the mid 20th century, America conceived of itself as the sort of God fearing, God worshiping nation fighting against the godless, atheist, Marxist, Leninist communists in the Soviet Union. And so part of our national identity, this is not a personal identity, this is part of our national identity, was even if people didn't believe in God or weren't religious, we still had a national identity of sticking up for freedom. And part of that freedom was freedom to believe, to worship, of conscience. When the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, um, that disappeared basically. And so that piece of American national identity was called into question. And from my point of view, we're still wrestling with what is America's place in the world? Who are we? And the point is, we didn't need Eisenhower era religion to sort of bolster our fight against communism. That was another thing, but there's a whole host of other things. The very beginning, the World Wide Web was launched in 1991. A certain generation of what eventually became smartphones came out in 1991. A whole lot of things happened culturally in 1991 that I think are significant in sort of turning the corner into a new zeitgeist. Seinfeld, which is famously known as a sort of a postmodern show about nothing, with hit #1 in 1991. Nirvana's hit "Smells Like Teen Spirit" rocketed to first place in 1991, and that put an end to a whole era of cultural music, big hair glam bands, and introduced a whole nother sensibility and style of dress and so on. So yeah, in the book I have long lists of things that happened in 1991. I don't think it was some kind of magical or catastrophic year, but I do think it was the turning point.
I don't recall you saying this in your book, but it seems like the 90s were really a key decade in the breakdown of the old mass culture,
Yeah.
in which we sort of had, like the all-time low of breweries in the United States was like in the 70s and 80s. It was a low point in a lot of ways, in consumer choice, 3 TV networks, and then we go to cable comes along. A lot of people wrote about kind of the decline of middlebrow culture, the common culture. That sort of get talked about in the 90s. Did cultural fragmentation play a role in this? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, that's a huge part of this story, and a lot of it can be traced back to the digital revolution. You go from analog to digital, and that makes possible all kinds of streaming. Again, you don't just have 3 newscasts that tell you authoritatively, here's what's going on in the world. You have hundreds of cable stations you can tune in. That starts to pull people in different directions. Eventually, with the invention of Google, I think one of the stories that I tell in the book is that the internet um, sort of liquidated gatekeepers and authorities. Like you didn't need to go to your pastor to find out the truth, or even the public library to read to learn something. You just type something in Google, you get a couple million returns, and now the burden's on you to figure out what's real, what's true. And those returns, of course, say everything that's possibly could be said. You've got to figure out what of that you believe. There's a lot of valuable stuff on the internet, and there's a lot of also we know misinformation and attention seeking and trying to get everyone's fear and anxiety going. So yeah, there was nobody on the internet who was a designated authority, like a book editor who said, this is worth publishing, that's not worth publishing. Listen to this, don't listen to that. It was up to each individual to figure out what was true for them. that interacted with other cultural shifts around postmodernism, which we could talk about if you wanted. But yeah, the 1990s, it also was a time of globalization. And so it wasn't just you in your city or your hometown in America. It was sort of connecting to the world, connecting to China, connecting to Africa, world music. So the underlying sort of cultural and institutional and technological infrastructure changed so fast and profoundly in the 90s that it had a lot of unintended consequences for traditional religion.
Yeah, the strongest point of your book, I think, is the way that you just go through point after point after point after point of how the culture changed, and the way that the changed culture was just not necessarily anti-religion, but
Yeah,
less aligned with like religion as we had traditionally understood it. And I think most of these things are things we'd say, "Oh yeah, I know that, I know that, I know that," but then you put them all together, you're like, "Wow, that's
yeah,
pretty depressing." But what
yeah.
are a couple, maybe a few more? You've highlighted a few of the things. What are maybe a handful of your favorite examples of these cultural changes and how they undermined the conditions of belief in Christianity? It made it seem obsolete. For
Yeah,
traditional religion, I should say,
there
because
are
I
so
think you
many.
include Judaism
So,
in there.
but just a couple that stand out. One, you would think it would have nothing to do with religion, was the rise of what neoliberal capitalism and globalized capitalism. So, uh, I can't go into detail here, but basically, millennials grew up in a world where their careers, their education, their occupations were very different. They're oriented very different than boomers grew up in. The world was globalized, technology was advancing, and neoliberal capitalism emphasized more competition. It involved less stability. So millennials had to always be ready to move. There was a lot more mobility, changing jobs, changing cities, maybe going overseas, needing to upgrade skills as technology changed. You can't be like stuck on the old program. So upgrade skills, maybe go to seminars, maybe get a graduate degree. Um, all of neo-capitalism, it wasn't trying to hurt religion, but it reshaped the world and the culture in a way that younger Americans realized, I can't settle in. I can't burn my bridges. I can't like sink deep roots. I need to be, for my career, I need to be ready to go. I need to be ready to move. I need to be ready to upgrade. And traditional religion in America historically is associated with settling down, putting down roots, becoming part of your neighborhood, your town, your city, getting to know people, investing in a community, all of that. Neoliberal capitalism moved young people in the opposite direction of that. So it disincentivized people young people from sort of settling down and committing to a congregation. That's just one example. Another is postmodernism. I don't think the world runs all by ideas, but postmodernism was a huge movement in the 90s. Came across from especially French humanities in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And if you were in the university in the 90s, you couldn't avoid postmodern sensibilities. Maybe not theories, but sensibilities. And whatever I talk in the book about popular postmodernism because most people didn't walk away with expertise in Nietzsche and Derrida and Foucault, right? But they come away with certain basic cultural sensibilities like knowledge claim, like everything is relative to your historical place and culture. You can't really make any claims to real truth. Truth was always in quotation marks. And people that are making knowledge claims, they're really out to control you through a power grab move over you. And you can't really know what an author intended to say. Authors are way too far away in the past. All any text means is what it means to you and to your tribe or your community. These kind of sensibilities, if young people absorbed them, and lots did, more or less, they basically communicate like they just completely don't fit with traditional religion. The idea that there's this authoritative scripture gets deconstructed in postmodernism. The idea that somebody outside of your own subjective feeling can tell you what's true is you got to be suspicious of that. You got to doubt that. You got to wonder what are they really after. The idea that something is universally or cosmically absolutely the truth in reality is liquidated. It's really just there is no truth. It's just whatever seems true to whoever. So again, that originally started as sort of literature, interpretive literature theory. It has powerful cultural effects by the time it works. It sort of trickles down and works its way out on the ground that makes traditional religion just it's a mismatch. It doesn't connect. It's like this. So yeah, those are just a few fascinating examples. September
You know,
11th also had an effect. Like I could just go on and on, but yeah,
there's probably like 30 or more of those things.
yeah,
What you talked about with neoliberalism, and maybe that they I don't know if you use this exact phraseology, but it really resonated with me, is this idea that like people in America had this sort of view of organized religion as sort of the religion for people who have their act together with sort
hmm
of settled lives. There was
hmm
also a strain that like if you really screwed up, fell into alcoholism, or you really screwed up, religion's good for that. But otherwise, religion's good for people. You're married, you have kids, you want moral formation of your kids in the church. And now that so many people are not settling down, they're not getting married, they're not having kids. People talk about capstone marriage. You get married after you've
right.
accomplished it. It's almost like you would go to church after you had accomplished all that stuff and then finally gotten married. Then I'll go to church. But by that point, you've already been essentially formed as an adult persona, and there's no place for religion in it.
Yeah. So part of the story in my book is that most Americans have these ideas about what religion is and what it's good for. It's actually most Americans' ideas of what religion is good for actually varies pretty dramatically from what religions themselves say they have to teach and what they think they're offering. Um, but nonetheless, Americans think, well, religion is good if it helps people be moral. It's very moralistic, helps people make good choices, helps people be psychologically cope with life, challenges of life, helps people have a nice local community. It provides sort of role models if when clergy, do good things in public. And it's a very functionalist orientation or expectation of religion, and it's very this worldly. It's not really about sovereignty of God or eternity or heaven and hell or salvation or cosmic destiny. It's not about those things. It's about helping people cope and do okay, do well, have happy lives here on earth. So what happened in the 1990s and 2000s was every single one of those expectations of what makes religion good was either marginalized or violated in some way. And so people walked away saying, well, I guess religion isn't good. I guess you don't really need it. So so functionally it ceased to in most people's minds, especially young people, serve the needs they thought religion was supposed to be. I don't blame it all on America. Well, blame, I don't like the word. It's not all a matter of Americans have the wrong ideas. I think religions over time played into this a lot. It's like, well, that's our audience, that's our market, we want to meet it. So if you go to, even today, you go into very many congregations, if you're tuned in and pay attention, they are still very oriented toward traditional nuclear family. Two heterosexual parents with children, maybe the grandparents are hanging around, and the children's school schedules and so on. So, young people who are cohabiting or who live alone and are on Tinder or who, are never going to have children, or couples who decide to delay or never have children, all these different non-traditional family forms or divorce, they don't feel at home in religion. They don't feel fully accepted. Maybe they're judging themselves in their head, or they're imagining other people judging them, or maybe they really are being judged, but it doesn't fit for them. It feels off. And so they will be more likely to avoid it. Like we just know this empirically from
Mm-hmm.
lots of studies. So all it requires is over time, family forms, marriage to change. And there's less and less of a pool of people who are naturally interested in what religious congregations are best at offering.
Mm. On the postmodern thing, I want to ask you about it because the idea of like postmodernism and relativism, it seems very big from like the 80s and the 90s,
Hmm.
maybe even the 2000s. But as we get into the 2010s, it seems like we've become much more conformist and moralistic.
Hmm.
Um, if 3 years ago, you could not have walked into a meeting in America and said, "I don't agree with all of this ESG stuff." You'd be fired from your job. I kind of have a sense that we've had more of an Orwellian turn
Hmm.
in some respects. Now, things have gotten a little crazy in the last year. So again, I don't think that's one element out of many, many, many things. But I'm curious if you've seen that evolving. To what extent does postmodernism? It seems like the postmodernist moment faded. Maybe is that still? Do you still see that as live as it was, or was that play a role in a period of time in the past?
No, I think it had its peak in the 90s,
Hmm.
um, and is less like officially or less obviously influential. But a couple of points on that. One
Hmm.
is one thing I argue in the book is just because something loses its sort of luster doesn't mean its influence goes away. I actually use the image of particulates that go in the cultural atmosphere that come out of smokestacks and wood stoves and automobile pipes. Think something like the ideas of postmodernism get ejected, or volcanoes eject these particulates into the atmosphere, and then they diffuse and they spread out. Just because postmodernism may have gone out of fashion, a lot of it is still out there floating around, again, in the popular, not even conscious or ideological form, but in people's sensibilities and people's deep assumptions. So, my own view is that postmodernism was a mix of like some really valuable critiques of modernity and also just a lot of crazy, silly, impossible to defend,
Hmm.
positions, way overstated positions. So it had enough truth in it that it was compelling. It had enough controversy in it that a lot of academics thought, well, I'll use this to help build my, careers and get publications. And I think a lot of young people, I mean, I interviewed millennials when they were teenagers in the 2000s, and I think but they were caught between the relativism, but also knowing, well, I can't say, almost no teen could say there's no right or wrong. Like everything is totally relative. But I don't think that was ever really resolved in their heads, figured out, well, what to do with it. So it just kind of lingers along with other things. Clearly, the world has changed since the 2000s, 2010s. Um, Politics have changed, economics have changed, geopolitical order has changed. So my book is really focused on the 90s and 2000s, and not the current time. But
Hmm.
for this discussion, yeah, I'm not sure exactly where things are going. I'm not sure if the millennial zeitgeist will be over and something new will emerge. But my general assumption is things don't disappear. Like it's like ancient civilizations. You wreck a city and build the next one on top of it. But it's even more complex than that. Along the particulates in the atmosphere, these things still float around and have influences, even if people aren't aware of them, and even if it's not like headline news today.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, we're certainly not going back to the pre, 1980s, 70s kind of mentality. That's definitely on that,
Yeah.
out. What happens in the future? I think it'll be interesting to see myself. That's what I say. Always
Mhm.
changing is the future. I mean, again, I thought there were so many incredible examples, and you go through them, and you're not only like, well, here's an example of something that changed. Here's like 10 implications for the culture from this cultural change. So I think people should find it really useful because, again, we are aware of like many of these things happening, but we haven't necessarily sat down and really systematically thought
Mhm.
about, okay, how did this affect
Mhm.
the perceived relevance even of religion, or just that it just doesn't even compute for people,
Yeah, that's
and
exactly right. Like we've known for quite a while from lots of studies that religion has been declining. Um, Attendance, belief in God, like just so many metrics have been decreasing over the last a couple decades. What's been missing, though, is an explanation how and why. Why did this happen? There have been some sort of stabs at, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. So the main purpose of this book is not to document religion's decline. It's to explain it. It's to help people understand what brought this about. And again, most of the factors involved are not explicitly intentional anti-religious movements. There are a few of those, but not in general. Most of them are forces that had nothing to do with religion, but they're, lo and behold, they're unintended consequences sort of cut the legs out from under religion. So there's a lot of irony here. There's a lot of unintended consequences here. And the other thing is, I felt an obligation writing this book to spell out the causal mechanisms. That you can't just say the internet hurt religion. Okay,
Yeah.
people can have that intuition, but what we really need is to understand how did it, why did it, what was it about the internet that would have unintentionally harmed religion? And so I spell out 10 different causal mechanisms that I think people have a sense of, but everything from the amount of time people now spend on the internet, the lack of authoritative gatekeepers, which I discussed earlier, the ability to find new communities online in social media, the ability to ask questions and get a much, much, much broader range of information about the world and other religions and alternatives than we used to have, the ability to go online and ask questions about one's own doubts, one's own confusions, one's own skepticism, the ability to form communities of X something, X evangelicals, X Mormons. They're out there online. They're organized in a way that would have been nearly impossible other than a printed newsletter in a previous era. So yeah, I really wanted to help people. I mean, my vision of sociology is it helps people understand what's going on in the larger world, the context around them, so that they can sort of not just understand it, but think through, what does this mean? What do we do about this? So yeah, but in order to do that well, you have to explain, what is it about neoliberal capitalism? What is it about September 11? What is it about whatever that harmed religion? Another important thing, again, another important piece of my argument is along the lines of, most of these forces were not out to, they didn't intend to hurt institutional religion. There are a few, like the New Atheists, but what I argue is religion did a lot more to damage itself than anti-religious forces did to harm religion. In many ways, religion made missteps and terrible errors and sins, that really seriously damaged religion's credibility and polluted it in the minds of very many Americans. For example,
You mentioned that one of the things the internet, the implications of the internet, the discoverability of sort
yeah,
of oppo research is now much, much higher than it would have been in the 1980s. Where how would you have ever found
exactly.
out?
Exactly. So it used to be, I'm not sure that religious leaders are anymore can commit any more sins or scandals, but in the age of the internet, if somebody gets caught, that can go viral within days. Like, that can spread around the world, that information. And along with that emerged um, a kind of a gotcha culture, or I mean, it's all these things are interconnected, but a kind of a, let's find a supposedly righteous leaders and pull them down. Yeah, I mean, this shows up in so many like daytime television shows. Dr. Phil was the '80s, but people fighting. So journalists who at one time would have, or editors would have said, we're not going to go there, Catholic priests, we're not going to bother them, are now, it emerged a world where it's like, no, we're going to write about that. We're going to tell that story. And the more that ball gets rolling, like a snowball downhill, the more other journalists and other editors and other readers and everyone else wants to know, all the bad stuff that's going on in the world.
Well, the irony, of course, is it didn't just affect the church, it affected every institution and authority, including the media. Every
Yeah,
time one of these reporters says something that somebody can clip it, but the clip is on the internet, it's like,
yeah,
ABC reporter just got suspended for tweeting something
yeah,
about Stephen Miller, and it's like everybody. Uh,
yeah,
so
exactly.
it's a
And so
general change in the culture. It's not just
yeah,
religion. It's
part of what's going on here is a long-term growing distrust of all institutions, except maybe the military. Literally every other institution for decades, Americans have been losing trust in, and including religion. And once that sort of landslide starts to fall down the mountain, it just picks up so much and pushes so much more down along with it.
I believe you're a Catholic. So the question I would ask is, what do those of us who believe in traditional religion do in light of all this information?
Yeah. So I'm a sociologist, and this book is sociology. It's not
Right.
theology,
Right.
ethics, church consulting, or anything. Again, I view my job as trying to help people understand the big picture as accurately and thoroughly as possible. Um, there are some sociologists who think they know everything and want to tell the world how it should be. I'm not one of those. I think the world needs to, the world, I think people who are interested in this, who have a stake in it, need to understand it better and then deliberate, have conversations, reflect on what to do about this. I personally really don't have a lot of answers. I hesitate to say do this or that, partly because I don't even know what I would say.
Mhm.
Obviously, you can say, well, stop having scandals. You can say, rethink. But I really believe it's up to traditional religious people and communities to do the hard work of figuring out what does this mean? What are we going to do about
Yeah.
this?
One of the things that you kind of make the point is that religion. One of the problems that kind of traditional religion in America faces is its practices are sort of wedded to now archaic social and cultural forms.
Hmm.
Uh, and when I look out there, it's small to be sure. I see you'll hear a lot about people going to traditional Latin mass
Hmm.
or uh, Eastern Orthodoxy. It's like some people are trying to jump back to sort of paleo archaic uh,
Hmm.
forms. Uh, oh, what do you make of that? Do you have any thoughts about that? What that represents?
Yeah. So, I mean, my book is focused on the big picture, macro culture. But if you get closer to the ground, you see different things going on. You see, for a while, evangelical churches were trying to be, like rock concerts or totally hip. Or you see, there's, again, as you point out, there's more recent waves of people getting back to tradition, smells and bells, or roots in history. That's been going on. I think there will always be a demand for that. I think that there's a set of young people. I mean, I know there's a set of especially younger people who think, man, what we've inherited is not great. Like just going liberal is not the solution to
Hmm.
anything. And I feel rootless. I feel like the party culture I grew up in is stupid and shallow. And so there is some demand for even more traditional religion. Um, as a sociologist, I always want to know, okay, how many are there of those people? What percentage of the population? So these are certainly happening, but I think they are micro movements and not where the masses are going. Where the masses are going are not really even secularism. It's either just a generic, not religious, but very many Americans are going into re-enchanted cultures of, again, spirituality, witchcraft, paganism, Wicca, alternative healing, or light versions of that, manifesting and chakras and
Hmm.
so on. So, um, if you want to find something that's out there, the question is how big is it, and how culturally significant is it? Like, what will it change? But again, my book was sort of going up to 30,000 feet, looking at the continental level. And when I look from that perspective, I see obsolescence. At least that's what's happened with post
Hmm.
boomers.
Yeah, the challenge of writing a book is it takes so long for it to come out that
Yeah,
things happen. And one of the things that people talk a lot about is this so-called vibe shift. One of the scholars that you cite in the book, Ryan Burge, I don't know if it's Burge or Berge, how you pronounce his name,
I've
but
always said Burgee. Yeah, but I could be
okay,
wrong.
Burge. Okay, yeah, yeah. So, um, he's been sort of tweeting, not his peer-reviewed paper, but his sort of some of his kind of real-time things have been like he's the rise of the nuns guy, and the nuns have sort of like stopped rising
Yeah,
statistically in the last few years. And you start seeing these nascent, I'm not sure if they're really statistically significant or not, but kind of rises in young Gen Z people attending church, it seems to me a lot. We have a lot of there's a pattern of social science statistics where there's a trend that's going like this for years or decades, and then it
Hmm.
just hits the wall.
Yeah.
Out of wedlock births, boom, 40% plateau.
Hmm.
We had like divorce, boom, it hit 50%, fell back to 40%, and kind of seems to be there. Obesity is another one, although it may have the drugs, may have something to do with it. Boom, obesity just stopped rising. So a lot of
Hmm.
these things just stop happening. So it made me think maybe this trend will just flatline at some point. It's just got that in the back of my mind. I'm wondering what you think of these recent developments.
Yeah.
What
Yeah. Good question.
if you have any thoughts? You don't have to. It's
Yeah. No, I
kind
have
of
about four thoughts here. So
mm,
the first is, yeah, the Pew Research Center also came out with a report recently that suggested maybe the rise of the nuns has plateaued. My view statistically is that maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. We need more. We need more years of data to really see where that's going. But even if it's plateaued, 2 points about that. One is, I mean, we always knew it would plateau. Eventually, you run out of religious people to become non-religious, right?
mm,
Trends can't continue forever, and they never do. So, nevertheless, we need to keep our eye on the fact not that it's plateaued, but that it went from 6 to 7% to 30 some percent, and even
mm.
more among post boomers. That's the real story. The huge growth. The second thing is we need to beware of the latest news and Twitter or whatever. Um, I hate to come across as cynical, but religious leaders are desperate for any good news. So anything that says maybe there's some bit of light out there, there's almost like a desperation or a wishful thinking for that. And journalists too can't keep saying the same thing over and over and over. Like they need new headlines. And so there are forces that push focusing more on small things than on the big picture. The second thing is that I show in the book is that religious change, especially what's been going on, but for much of the 20th century, religious change is generational. It's not that individuals radically change when they hit 40 or 60. It's boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. And so put that together with the fact that we know that the most important factor in shaping the religiousness of any given person is their family and their parents. So if you have increasing generations that are less religious, and we know that's absolutely the case, when they grow up and raise their children are going to be less religious because unless there's been some big revival or something like that, which could happen, um, they're going to have not that they're less religious parents. So there's a sociological downward spiral, so to speak. Or if you're an atheist, it's an upward spiral, depending on how you look at it. So yeah, again, I think what we need to keep our eye on are the big long-term trends in all this. Having said that, my book is focused on something that has happened. I'm not predicting the future. I can't even speak to where things are now. I really focus on the 90s and 2000s. I do think that, when my undergrads, and some undergrads read the manuscript and they said, yeah, it's just the same today. It's only even more intense.
Mhm.
So it's even worse. So, however, I'm perfectly, history changes, zeitgeists change. The world will certainly not stay in the millennial zeitgeist. Where it goes, I don't know. It could be that my book becomes like an interesting documentation of a certain period of time. As I said before, the ramifications, the longer term consequences in the culture will remain for a long time. But other events, forces, technological changes, we have no idea. AI, robotics, like world politics, so many things could change that change the underlying conditions. I personally am highly doubtful that there will be like some kind of big religious revival. Again, I think where things are going are not toward traditional religion, but re-enchanted culture.
When I think about obsolete, I think about obsolescence. It's very often the case that when something becomes obsolete, you say it doesn't mean nobody's doing it, that it's not extinct, but obsolescence does tend to produce extinction and changes the conditions of society that make it very difficult to
Hmm.
continue doing the thing that is now obsolete. So when the horse and buggy went obsolete,
Hmm.
uh, it became very difficult to continue living a horse and buggy lifestyle in the
Hmm.
automobile world. You know, if you wanted to say I'm going to opt out of the digital and survive, live my life with a landline telephone only and no smartphone, it's very, very difficult to do that
Hmm.
today and maybe physically impossible at a future point. So, yeah, people like the Amish are able to do that, but it requires an incredible high cost restructuring of your life.
Yeah, it
I
requires
think
a lot of
about
commitment.
I'm a huge fan of print newspapers. I get multiple of them, and I'm just waiting for the day when I get the notification that they're not going to produce it anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to be able to read it. Is do these conditions, if they persist, is religion viable at any scale in America? If if these things persist in this manner,
Mhm.
and it really is, if we say it's obsolete, is there something that will essentially undermine the viability of a religious project in America?
Yeah, I think what you've just described is correct in that when traditional religion goes obsolete, it becomes more difficult. There's less sort of social support, less institutional support to make it happen. Um, at some point, the metaphor breaks down. Automobiles and horse and buggies are different than religion. Like it's the, so to answer your question, I think there will always be a minority of Americans who are religious and who are committed to that. Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist. I don't think it's going to go extinct by any stretch. It's just a matter of how small those populations are. There will always be, I think, sort of retro movements, as we've already discussed about Latin Mass and other more traditional Eastern Orthodox. Just like, my son-in-law has a collection of vinyl records. Like there will always be people who appreciate and are interested in that. I think the number of Americans who remain in religious and raise children who are religious will be larger than the Amish. It'll be a significant minority. Uh, maybe leaner and meaner. Some people will say, well, the churches will be more faithful if they have a smaller number of more committed people rather than just sort of all these nominally committed, not even committed, nominally religious people. So yeah, what's sociologically fascinating is where will things go? But yeah, I don't think churches are about to go out of business. The number of churches closing their doors is increasing, et cetera, et cetera. But at some point, as we said about numerical trends, it'll probably hit a plateau and stay there for a while. And qualitatively, it'll change. Like it's not just a matter of numbers; it's a matter of what does it feel like? What's being taught? What's the character of religion? So you go to a mainline Protestant church in the 50s, it had a certain character. You go to an evangelical Protestant megachurch in the 80s, it has a very different character. You can count the numbers of bodies, but what's going on there has been transformed too.
Yeah, the one thing I thought about here is the way that society was sort of structured around that assumption that Sunday morning is blocked
Hmm.
off because
Hmm.
people go to church, and now there's a lot of travel sports on Sundays and Sunday
Yeah,
morning. So people with kids, if you want your kids to do travel sports, you got to miss church.
yeah.
And so the question is like, oh, you got to now you got to sacrifice travel sports if you want your kid to go to church. I can just definitely see the cost going up and up and up as society becomes less accommodative of people
Exactly.
who are are who are religious. It'll be
Yeah, I mean
interesting.
this draws attention to the point that religion is not just a matter of personal commitment. It involves community, it involves cooperation. So just some metaphors for that. If you want to be in a community, if you want to be in a church choir, you can't do that on your own. There have to be enough other people to make the choir sing. If you want to be on email, you have to have this is called a network effect. You have to have a critical mass of enough others for it to even to work. Um, if you want to be a 22-year-old who wants to get married, have a traditional marriage, be not be hooking up all the time, that's great. It requires other people who want to do that with you. and there are the other people out there, but there are fewer and fewer. So the point, it's just your basic point about it. It's a social dynamic. There's a matter of institutional and social support or lack of support. Now, I talk about the intensive parenting movement. So if you're a parent, there was a certain time in the 90s and 2000s where you've got to schedule your kids for lots of sports and art classes and music classes and play dates and all this that really ramped up expectations on being a good parent, a lot of which, as you said, conflicted with, well, Wednesday night we're supposed to go to catechism class or Bible study. Well, we can't do that because we're on traveling soccer. It's not that the parents don't want to get their kids in the church, it's that the whole social order around them has changed so that you actually start to feel like you're a bad parent by taking your kid to catechism class instead of the traveling soccer team. And maybe you're literally disadvantaging your kids because their resume in a neoliberal competitive world will be less impressive in a college application if they're not in all kinds of sports and drama productions. So yeah, it's not a matter of just individual commitment. It's a matter of the infrastructure to support or to make natural or easier being a religious of a certain way. And so what that means is over time to continue being religious traditionally demands higher commitment, higher investment, a willingness to forego or to suffer the opportunity costs.
I got one last question. Whenever we have conversations about decline of religion or all of these things, I think for most religious people, the very first thought is, how does this affect us? Which
Mm-hmm.
is understandable. But I always like to point people, well, how does it affect the rest of society?
Mm-hmm.
So you may not agree with this, but one of the things I've always said is like Donald Trump being president is only possible in a post Christian America, which I think there are so many ironies in Donald Trump's presidency on that regard. And you hit at this a little bit in the book. What are the implications for the non religious in America as a result of these new cultural conditions? One intriguing point I think you made was that we should expect mental health problems to increase.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we've seen that a
Yeah.
lot more mental health problems and things of that nature. How is this going to affect the lives of the non religious compared to, say, people who were in the 1980s?
Yeah. So it's clear because, again, we're talking about a social thing and not just an individual thing. The fate of traditional institutionalized religion will affect the fate of the larger social order, whether or not anyone is religious. So I can't predict the future, but we can project based on what we believe we know about the past. You know, traditional religion has been for a very long time a source of social order, a source of local community, a source of psychological mental coping, a source of social support, um, of benevolence, invention of institutions like hospitals and orphanages, people taking care of each other when they're down financially. Uh, Robert Putnam, a Harvard political scientist, estimated some decade or two ago that religion is a source of half of America's social capital. That is, trusting, bonded, bridging relationships. So that's the case in the past. Unless those functions are replaced by something else, and I think very many people would say, don't count on the federal government to do that. And the federal government can't create community, right? It can only do certain things. Unless those religious functions are replaced by in other ways, there will be a decline, and there has been a decline in social capital, in trusting relationships, in community, in mental health. COVID certainly contributed to this and sort of put it on steroids, but everybody's talking about young generations have a crisis of loneliness, isolation, mental health. Uh, you know, it's partly social media, it's partly COVID, but it's also partly the decline or the obsolescence of traditional religion. I'm not suggesting, oh, we can somehow go back or turn back the clock, but yeah, this will have real consequences. Speaking about politics, I agree with you about the Trumpism. I don't want to get into politics too much here. It's not the main focus of my book. But
Right.
what I find interesting is the transformation of the discourse of the Christian right from in the 1980s and even 90s. The arguments were we need righteous, godly men and women elected to office to, defend Christian, the Christian roots of America, and to have laws that will honor God. That kind of discourse.
Hmm.
That's been completely thrown overboard now, and now it's sort of like, oh, we'll take the most godless, lying. I mean, I think these are just objective facts. I'm not even being political here. Like he's divorced, grabbing women's bodies,
Hmm.
prostitutes, all this kind of thing. We need that to defend us, to protect us. So the language has gone away from we need to sort of strengthen America morally into we need a protector. This is among evangelicals. We need someone who will protect us. One question I think is a legitimate question to ask about my argument in the book is how does if religion is obsolete, how do you explain Christian nationalism? It seems to have a lot of power and influence. My response is Christian nationalism is, I think, a symptom of obsolescence, not contradictory evidence. It shows a desperation. I think that's what it reveals, a desperation that is a manifestation of people increasingly realizing we're going obsolete. Like we don't matter the way we used to. We're under threat here. It gets focused on liberals and immigrants and the other. And again, I hope my book helps to show no, these things are much broader, bigger, long term, and complex than just that. So, yeah, so I don't think Christian nationalism disproves obsolescence. I think it shows it. And I think I agree with you that the Trumpism is a real, the politics of Trumpism is an indicator that something else has really also shifted in some kind of plate tectonic way. The tension of the plates just shifted like that. And it both reflects changes in religion and will have consequences for religion.
Yeah, well, the I think the idea of religious minority looking to some type of strongman figure is something we see repeated throughout the world. I think serious Christian communities supported the Assad people because, like, well, we're protecting you from the Islamists. We'll give you a
Mhm.
space, but you got to be loyal in return. And I think those sorts of politics and things deriving from sort of hyper diverse societies or things of that nature, we're going to see more and more of interesting developments over
Yeah,
time.
yeah. And these among people who allegedly believe in the
Yeah.
Bible that says, trust not in chariots of
Hmm.
Pharaoh. But
Yeah.
I'm not in charge of the world. Like I'm
Hmm.
just trying to describe and analyze it. But
Hmm.
there's huge amount of ironies, and it's all just completely fascinating, even if
Yeah.
for some people it'll be depressing.
Well, it is a depressing book, but it's a very, very good book. And I encourage people to read it because it really does give you like an insight to start thinking about these cultural trends and like how do these affect the cultural conditions for religion to flourish or not flourish. Very
Hmm.
important. Again, the book is called "Why Religion Went Obsolete." It's by my guest, Christian Smith, Notre Dame sociologist. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. It's been fun talking.